In this episode of the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast, I have a fun one for you. And who else would I bring on than the guy that knows or watches more college basketball than anyone else? It is my guy, Leif Thulin. And in this episode, we are going to talk about Alabama's stacked roster. I have two questions I want to ask. One, is there too much talent at Alabama? And number two, is Alabama's second unit, would they be a top 25 team? So stay tuned to hear Leif's thoughts on the Alabama Crimson Tide, which is now, I would say, a basketball school. Big shout out to each and every person that has made the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast your first listen of the day. I'm your host, Rafael Barlowe, the director of scouting for NBA Big Board, and my co-host for today is Leif Thulin, mentioned in the open, the guy that watches more college basketball than anyone I know. He eats, sleeps, and breathes college basketball. And I'm sure he knows that we are down to about 76 days until the start of the college basketball season. So with this much time, I want to just talk about Alabama. But before we get into the episode, I want to let you know that it is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA. You can get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. And if you're not subscribed to the YouTube channel, please subscribe. What's taking so long? Subscribe, like, share, comment. That is the best way to help us grow the channel, but definitely leave a comment, share your thoughts, whether they are crazy or not. I mean, there's some people that get pretty offended about some of our takes if they disagree. I'm like, whoa, man, it's just an opinion. But anyway, we love all the comments. So again, if you're not subscribed, please subscribe. All right, Leif, let's just dive right into this episode. When you saw Alabama's roster for this season, what is the first thing that came to your mind? Because I can tell you what came to my mind is they got a ridiculous amount of talent.
Well, yeah, so in college basketball day, like getting old is really good. Like Kentucky and Duke kind of revitalized the idea that freshmen can win, made it popular. One and done started to go to different places. Arkansas, Baylor started doing some of that. Well, getting old's become what's won and now is popular with NIL. What Alabama did was they brought back a guy who's probably going to be a first-team All-American in Mark Sears, who was second team last year. They brought back a very popular player who ended up playing his best basketball of the season in the tournament in Grant Nelson. They brought back who I consider a top 15 prospect for next year in Jarin Stevenson. They bring in Cliff Omoruyi, who's the most coveted defensive center in the country via Rutgers. And they bring in Youngblood from USF, who made USF popular. They didn't make the tournament, but they won their conference in the regular season. And they already had some guys lined up to come. Mallette was coming from Pepperdine before the season even ended. So to answer your question, is there too much talent? I don't know, but that's a good question to have. I think it's not a problem to have that question surface. And they also bring back Latrell Wrightsell. I knew I was missing someone. So they basically retained 4 starter-level players and brought in a transfer that was among the most coveted in the country, and then added an in-state transfer, Aden Holloway, Pepperdine transfer, Xavier Mallette, or Houston Mallette, excuse me. You look at these additions, and it's going to be a jigsaw puzzle. If you can figure out how to align these players and get the most out of them properly and have kind of cohesion on the team together, I think they could be the best team in the country. I'm really excited. This may be the team I'm most eager to watch because they're going to play a fun, exciting brand of basketball, and they have the talent at each position. Whereas I think in the past couple of years, the reason they've been inconsistent is they've lacked production at a certain position. This year, they are too deep at every spot.
Every spot. That just the players that you announced, from Sears to Wrightsell to Stevenson to Nelson, and then the transfers, Chris Youngblood, Omoruyi, Aden Holloway, Houston Mallette. To me, that alone right there is a top 10 team. But we haven't even talked about the freshmen. Derrion Reid, who was a highly touted recruit. Nasir Cunningham, who I think just 2 years ago may have been the number 1 player in his class. And then you got Labaron Philon. I mean, this team is just ridiculously stacked. In your opinion, how do you think Nate Oates will manage such a deep roster and so with so much talent, and how can he keep everybody happy?
Well, I think the first key is probably appeasing the upperclassmen. And I actually think it's the right thing in terms of the basketball. I think the starters will go as follows. Mark Sears at the point guard. I think you're going to see Chris Youngblood at the two guard, or I guess three, the wing, Latrell Wrightsell. And then the interesting thing will be, will Jarin Stevenson start and Latrell Wrightsell slide to the two? But I think it's going to be Youngblood because I bet you there's a guarantee like, oh, you come here, you're going to start. I personally would play a lot of Stevenson because, like I said, I think he can be a top 15 player. Four is going to be Grant Nelson. Five is going to be Omoruyi. And the question is going to be is between Wrightsell, Youngblood, and Stevenson, who are going to occupy the two and the three. So
So,
that's the question. You got to figure that out. And then I think the rest of them slot in spots. Like Mallette slots in a designated spot. Holloway slots in at a point guard. Doesn't make much sense to me that he transferred from Auburn to get less playing time in an in-state school. But this is probably the second best team in the country, in my opinion, on paper behind Kansas. But the reason it's an appealing spot, even if you are off the bench at Alabama, is because they play so fast that nobody can play at that speed 40 minutes. So there's going to be enough minutes to go around, as opposed to some schools that play slower, where they eat up minutes more so. But I think a question that's going to be asked very early in the season is, are they going to have freshmen that are happy? Because I think these freshmen likely transfer in today's day and age. There's no, hey, I want to wait my turn. I'm a 5-star recruit. I went here to play a lot, and now all these older guys are playing in front of me. I think you're going to see unhappy freshmen, even if the next year they could have their starting minutes. But what's to say next year they don't go out and get these transfers that play in front of them? So I think you're going to see some unhappy freshmen, and I'd be pretty surprised to see them really infiltrate the starting lineup just because of how much depth of talent there is at Alabama.
all right, I got a question for you. You kind of alluded to it earlier. Who are their top two NBA prospects? And based off of this roster, do you think there's a good chance that their top two NBA prospects will not even start?
I think Jarin Stevenson's their best NBA prospect, and like I said, I think he's the fifth or the sixth man, so good chance he doesn't in that sense. Um, I would go with Reid as the second, but I will say it's different to watch a collegiate game as opposed to the high school and say like, oh, that athleticism pops. Does his shot translate? And if he doesn't play a lot, there's going to be such like little volume to sift through to determine, is he a good shooter? Is his athleticism next level athleticism? So he's a guy that I will be very cautiously evaluating because I just don't see a clear pathway for him to demonstrate his ability. But Jaron Stevenson, I think, does play 25 to 30 minutes, whether it's off the bench or starting.
But how can he play 25 to 30 minutes in your opinion? Because in my opinion, I think Stevenson has his best advantage if he's playing the four.
I
And you
agree with you.
and Grant Nelson is going to be the four, and I agree that Cliff probably starts. And so, do you put Stevenson in a situation where he's not playing his best position at the three to get him in the starting lineup? Because he's someone that, I mean, he's just too talented to keep off the floor. So, you think it could be a situation where he is in the lineup and they may start him at the three, and then they make a quick sub, and then he slides over to the four, or even play the five? Like, I'm just trying to figure out like how in the world do you put him in the best position, even though that's not the main focus. The main focus is trying to win a national championship. But yeah, like how do you play Reid and Stevenson? How do you make sure that you keep both of those guys happy?
Well, as for Stevenson, I think you do start him at the three, and then Latrell Wrightsell goes out of the game. Youngblood comes in, so he might be able to still play the three when there's a substitution, or like you suggested, he goes and plays the four. Nelson subs out, maybe comes in for Omoruyi and he plays the five, and there's going to be some sort of rotation. As for Reid, I don't know where the minutes come from, and I just mathematically it doesn't add up to me. Maybe he's so good he pushes his way past players in front of him, but I'm glad you made the point of the ultimate goal for Nate Oates this year is to win a national championship, the head coach of Alabama. And so many players and teams and media covering the game will talk about Duke or Kentucky the past few years, be like, well, why aren't they playing this player? This player needs NBA experience. Like, this is what his swing skill is. They should play the player they think wins them the most games. Because yes, you can win recruiting battles by saying, look, I had this player average 20 and I've sent XYZ amount of players to the NBA. But that's why John Calipari got fired at Kentucky, because all he was saying is I sent 33 players in the past 12 years to the NBA first round draft. And I've got so many all-stars. I have so many all-NBAs, but he hasn't won anything since 2011. And that's when he was playing the guys who deserved to play. There was no politics yet because he was still new. He should have won significantly more games, maybe not even championships, but significantly more games in the regular season and in the postseason, especially lately. If he wasn't just saying, "Oh, I guarantee you these minutes. I'm going to play this player this many minutes, and then I'm going to get this recruit, and we're going to do this." I'd be thrilled to see one of these freshmen like not be handed these minutes. And then yes, they can transfer, and everyone will be like, "Oh, in my day, we would have stuck it out." But that's the beauty of basketball right now. And if the reason for transferring is because the coach has aspirations of winning a national title and he actually goes for that rather than appeasing a freshman recruit, I'm for it. I may be in the minority of the draft community on that, but as you say in the intro each time, I love live, breathe, and sleep college basketball. As I was walking, because my parents had a car, we had short a car. Long story short, I was missing a car, so I ended up walking a few miles today, and I was just listening to SEC basketball podcast before I knew we were even talking about this. So I'm riled up, ready to talk about hoops, but this is a real thing that I think too many coaches don't play to win anymore. They play to play their players, and then eventually those guys will get them the right player down the road to win. And this is the way to win, is maybe you have to disappoint a guy like Reid who could be a one and done anywhere.
All right. In the second segment, I want to talk a little bit more about Alabama's talent. Like, do they have too much talent? And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into balancing the roles and the expectations. But before we get into the second segment, let's talk about something a little serious, BetterHelp, because this episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Give online therapy a try at betterhelp.com/lockedonnba and get on your way to being your best self. Because I want to know, what are your non-negotiables? Maybe you never skip leg day or therapy day. When your schedule was packed with kids and activities, big work projects, and more, it is very easy to let your priorities slip. Even when we know what makes us happy, it's hard and challenging to make time for it. But when you feel like you have time, or you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. So if you are thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It is entirely online. It is designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to fit your schedule. All you have to do is just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist. You can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So never skip therapy day with BetterHelp, and visit betterhelp.com/lockedonnba. You can get 10% off your first month. That is betterhelp.com/lockedonnba. And thank you again for making the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast your first listen of the day. And thank you again. I've said it before, but I really mean it. I appreciate each and every listen. There's a gazillion podcasts out there. And for us to get the listeners that we have, I'm just so grateful and thankful. But I have another podcast to suggest. It is the Locked On NBA podcast, because there is no offseason in the NBA. And Locked On NBA provides daily basketball analysis from national and local experts, and you get it in 30 minutes or less. There's no one that keeps you as informed and entertained as Locked On NBA. It's available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. It is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, when we left off in the first segment, we were just talking about Alabama's crazy depth and talent. And I want to dive a little deeper into like balancing the roles and the expectations, because Leif brought up a great point that, you got the whole John Calipari situation, or, he brought in the talent, he was recruiting, he was appeasing his freshmen in a sense, but he just wasn't winning games. And it seems like Alabama is trying to basically just, it sounds bad, I was going to say, buy the best team that they can, which I mean, that's kind of what college basketball is nowadays. Is if you have the collective and you have the budget, you can pretty much field an elite roster. And so I want to get Leif to talk a little bit more about how do you think Nate Oates can balance out this roster and this talent?
Well, in college basketball, there's 40 minutes. It's not 48 for the NBA, and I think that makes it so that you can really only play 8 or 9 players maximum by the time it matters. Like when you're in SEC play, when you're in the SEC tournament, you're in the NCAA tournament. I think 8 players playing is really the key. So you're going to have to tinker and say which are our best 8 that behoove our team, right, and improve our chances to win, as opposed to this is helpful to Reid's draft stock. This is helpful to the draft stock of Philon. Like, I don't think that'll be too much of an equation. And honestly, I think when they recruited versus what they're expecting now, if the expectation has changed that they should be allowed to switch schools, or if they're aware and did not hit the transfer portal, then it's fair. It's fair game that they're not going to necessarily play a lot, because unless I'm proven that they are better immediately for the chances of Alabama to win a championship, which is the goal. That should be the only goal for Alabama this year. Obviously, you'd like to win the SEC, you'd like to win the SEC championship, but the only goal should be an NCAA championship. I don't think that those players should necessarily be handed over playing time when you've got 8 players that we listed off that have experienced college basketball and have played at a very high level. And it's the problem of being a team with a national championship aspiration. There's players on UConn's teams the last few years that could have played many places. They waited their turn and ended up having a really good year in their second year of winning a championship. Perhaps that's the case with Alabama. Patience could be a virtue, but maybe it was short-sighted to attend Alabama. We'll see. And I think Nate Oates is really going to have to be deliberate about how he sets the expectations for playing time, especially for the youngsters and the transfers.
All right, I want to ask you about some potential position battles. In my opinion, I think we agree on this here. The position battles are at the 2 and the 3. Can you just give me some, like, in your opinion, some lineup experiments that you would do if you were Nate Oates?
Yeah, so part of me really likes the idea of Jarin Stevenson playing the 3, because your length is going to be unbelievable. Defensively, you're going to put a lid on the rim. Jarin Stevenson, Grant Nelson, Cliff Omoruyi is going to be the best front court in college basketball. You have a lock-in point guard at Mark Sears. So at the 2, you have either Latrell Wrightsell, who is a valuable contributor on a Final Four team last year. He and Rylan Griffin manned the wings for Alabama last year, along with Aaron Estrada, a smaller guard who was the 2. They had 3 players for 2 positions then too. But it's Jarin Stevenson. I would have put it the 3 initially, and then you say which one's better for us: Latrell Wrightsell's catch and shoot, kind of 3-and-D mold as a 2 guard, or the was a star player at USF in Chris Youngblood, and here's what he's going to be for us. That's the question right there. Then the next one will be, what if you played Youngblood and Wrightsell, much like Griffin and Wrightsell played last year, and Stevenson's bumped out. So that's a question. And then you have the question is Houston Mallette better than any of those guys? I think he's kind of the odd one looking in. But that's the way I'd start it. I think that would be my experiment. I personally lean towards you have a higher floor by taking the ability for the other team to score away by having Jarin Stevenson. You're already going to shoot a ton of threes. So unless Latrell Wrightsell or Chris Youngblood show the ability to score so much better than Stevenson, then I would play Stevenson, because Alabama had no issue scoring over. They were terrible defensively for much of the year. When they started playing better defense, they made the Final Four. They competed against every team they lost to throughout the regular season, barring a few road losses in the SEC play where the other teams just came out running and gun and rode the home crowds. They lost to Arizona in a close game. They lost to Creighton in a close game. They lost to so many close, good teams in close games. And then they put it together and beat teams in close games. Why? Because their defense was better. I think it ups their floor to play Jarin Stevenson's length, and perhaps their ceiling too, because if he shoots at all well, you have the most talented player in your roster playing along with 2 sizable players and a probable All-American. So I really think that's the way to go, but that's the way I'd conduct the experiment personally.
Here's my concern about Stevenson at the 3. Like last year, he took 158 shots. 101 of them were threes. I hope he's not in a situation where all he's doing is shooting threes. He shot 31% from last year. He's a respectable shooter, but to me, his advantage shooting the three ball is at the four. But I get what you're saying. If you just want to go defense, because like you said, they didn't have any issues scoring last year. If you just want to just go length, then it makes sense. And so Reid, we'll go back to Reid, 5-star recruit. I mean, do you think that he is just based off of where you're at now? I mean, do you think he's their third wing or fourth wing option?
Probably fourth. I mean, do I think he's going to be a better basketball player than Latrell Wrightsell? Probably. But I think there's so much to be said in college basketball about being old and having players that know their direct responsibility. Like his job is to guard wings and shoot open threes. He is the Danny Green of Alabama basketball.
Mhm.
And that's more valuable to me than a player who doesn't have a defined role, does have considerable upside, but it's a risk. And I would avoid those risks even if it angers a player because Alabama's an established brand. They can buy whatever players they want. They can recruit whatever players they want. If they lose him by trying to win a championship, that's a good way to lose a player. There's a lot of bad ways to lose a player. I think that's a respectable way. And I think if I'm Derrion Reid, I I probably respect it, honestly. It's like, well, I went in here, I thought I'd play. They built a really good team, and if we're winning a championship, maybe I can carve out a role. But if that's the way I'm shielded away from it, I have less problem in that than having this promised playing time, and I get handed the playing time, then I'm not very good, and then I'm rescinded playing time like other players have. So this is a good problem to have for Alabama. It may be a frustrating season internally for some of the freshmen.
Yeah, I agree. But in the next segment, I want to talk about their second unit, which we've already just kind of discussed some of the options. But I want to ask you, do you think their second unit could be a top 25 team? But before we get into that segment, let's talk about Game Time. Game Time is my favorite app when it comes to purchasing tickets because Game Time is the best app, in my opinion. Whenever I want to go somewhere to a game, I use Game Time simply because I mean, there's multiple options. I could choose why I like Game Time. One, they have plenty of options. So whether it's sports, concerts, comedy, theater, they have that. I love the all-in pricing. All you have to do is toggle this feature on the app and you get the total up front. There's no surprise fees at checkout. And then you get views of the seat. You get a panoramic view of the seat in the app before you buy, so you know exactly the view that you are going to see. I've had this experience and it's a seat. I forgot the name of the Atlanta Hawks arena. I guess it's State Farm Arena. I forgot what it was before, but there's like this seat where you have this view where you can't see the court. It's like the pillar is blocking you if the ball goes where I was sitting, it was to the left. So if I would have had the Game Time app when I bought that ticket, I would have known that that is a terrible seat. So with Game Time, you get a great view of the seat from the actual arena. And then there's the lowest price guarantee, and Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. And your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So take all the guesswork out of buying concerts or tickets to games with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code Locked On NBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, it's simple. Create an account, use the redeem code LOCKEDON NBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, last segment. We'll just get straight to it. Could Alabama's bench be a top 25 team? Is their second unit better than some teams that are going to be preseason top 25?
Probably. I don't know if they'd sustain as a top 25 team. I actually think this is the best year of college basketball in quite a while. Like last year, I think it was even on this podcast. I told you before the national championship, UConn was going to beat Purdue by 20 because their guards were so much better. It turned out it was 16 or something like that. But It like there was such a difference at the top of basketball to the next tier, and then if you extended it to the two seeds, like Tennessee had glaring flaws, and they were an Elite Eight team. Why I bring that up at the top to talk about this top 25 is I think there's teams that are in the 20s this year that are comparable to teams that were for much of the year 8 through 12. There's just far better depth. There's better level of basketball. I think there's a world in which the SEC and Big 10 alone, Big 12 alone, excuse me, SEC and Big 12 alone combined for 20 teams in the NCAA tournament. That sounds crazy. So maybe Alabama is and their bench is in that top 25, but I don't know if they'd consistently be able to be there because now you wouldn't have the stabilizing force of Mark Sears. You wouldn't have Cliff Omoruyi. You wouldn't have these guys that are established. You'd be taking a leap of faith. So I think they'd be a team that bounced around there. I think they would end up making the NCAA tournament and could be a dangerous team. I just don't think you'd have the consistency that would warrant like a top four seed, and that would be a top 15, 16 team. But there's no denying they're talented, none whatsoever. Talent wise, in terms of ceiling, their bench could be a top 15 team in the country, even.
Yeah, I mean, you can go Holloway. I mean, Mallette. I mean, you can even go in there's a world where you can go Holloway, Wrightsell, Reid, Stevenson, and then I mean, I guess you can play Stevenson at the five. I mean, they have so many. They have so many options. Do you think that their second unit could be a top five team in the SEC?
Yes. I will say yes, but it would be the fifth. I think that Bama's the best team in the SEC when fully functional. I think then you have to say there's some questions about other teams. I would probably go Bama one, Texas A&M two, Arkansas, Tennessee, Auburn is probably my top five. I would take all those teams I mentioned over Alabama without their starting lineup. But I wouldn't mind Alabama over Ole Miss, Florida, and Kentucky, maybe Texas as the next three or four. I think the Bama second unit's probably better than those teams, but I don't think they're necessarily better than Texas A&M, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Auburn. So I would say fifth.
And I forgot I haven't even mentioned Aden Sherrill. Like it's hard that, this is a guy that a lot of people considered a top 30, 40 prospect in the country. He was a four-star recruit according to 24/7. And he's someone that we haven't even mentioned. So I think that Nate Oates, he's in a good situation to have so much depth and talent, but managing just the players, managing everything that comes with players nowadays, whether it's like their AAU coaches, managers, or parents. I mean, there's a lot of people you have to keep happy. A lot of people you have to keep happy, along with yourself when you're trying to win. Do you think Aden Sherrill could be their backup five, like in that
I
second
mean,
unit? And so he could be the five in that second unit. Or do you think they'll just stagger the lineups where Stevenson and Grant Nelson, those three guys are going to
that
be?
that's the way I'm inclined. The way I think about college basketball, like I mentioned, at the highest level, I think you play eight players. So I think when you have the versatility you have in a guy that can play three through five and Stevenson, you got Nelson who can play four and five. You have the athleticism of Reid. Not all those guys are natural fits at five, but I would lean towards their proven production for the most part, just in the college basketball floor, even if not at the position, just to maximize getting the best eight players the most playing time.
All right, here's a question for you, and I'm sure the Alabama coaching staff, if they're listening, may not want to hear this. How do you think with today's climate, with players being able to transfer year round, or just be able to transfer and play immediately, how much do you think that is going to have an impact on just like the overall locker room? Because I you can imagine some of those top freshmen or even some of those transfers turn down some pretty good schools, and coaches or people are going to be in their ears saying, "Hey, look, you could have went here, you could have played." How difficult do you think it's going to be for Nate Oates to manage that?
Well, I alluded to that a little bit earlier in the sense that I think they're going to lose a couple of these freshmen because the next year, let's say Alabama doesn't win a championship, you lose Sears because he's going to graduate. You lose Nelson, you probably lose Stevenson to the NBA if you get that far. And then you say, well, okay, well, naturally Reid's going to step in. Naturally, you're going to see these guys. No, Alabama's got so much money, and the best way to win right now is in the transfer portal that they're going to be able to buy the players that they think give them the best chance to win. So if it's playing what would be a returning sophomore at that point in Reid, in Labaron Philon, you look at those type of players, I'm not certain that the recipe is stick around for them personally, much less is that the best recipe for Alabama. So yes, it'll be interesting in terms of managing relationships with players in the way that you recruit freshmen, because Alabama now has the ability to get the 5-star freshmen, but how many of them will actually play? And will that factor into the future of who you get? That's why Kentucky was always able to get the 5-star freshmen, because no matter what, they were given the reins. For better or worse in terms of Kentucky basketball, if I were a Kentucky basketball fan, which I'm not, I'd be furious at Calipari. I would have been furious because your job is to win basketball games, not appease recruiting, appease recruits and make money. So I think Nate Oates has a good position to have because they're going to win games. And sometimes players are just that good that they can start immediately. Example number one, Stephon Castle came in, actually got injured, still came in, started, won a national championship on a team that just won the national championship, that brought in transfers, that brought in talented players. You can do it, but I think it's going to cause a ripple effect for recruits. Oh, I don't know if I want to go to Alabama because they're going to buy a guy at my position and I'm not going to play if that happens this year. Could happen, but then Alabama's just going to get another player and all the transfers are going to want to go there. So I don't think Nate Oates is necessarily in a bad position in terms of his coaching spot. I think it'll be difficult to manage and kind of babysit if a team's immature on how to do it. Like I always said, and maybe I was wrong, maybe I was being short-sighted, but when I was a teenager, I always said, oh, I could coach the Warriors and we'd win a championship because they have Kevin Durant, Steph Curry, Andre Iguodala, Draymond Green, Klay Thompson. Doesn't take a genius. What I will say is Steve Kerr managed egos really, really well. I think that's going to be the most important part of communication and maturity for this Alabama team in order for Nate Oates to have a successful tenure, not only this year, but in the future as the transfer portal figures into the landscape of college basketball.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I had a conversation with a very, very well-known coach a couple years ago, and I was asking him about there was a group of freshmen that were highly touted, and they're all from the same area, and he only chose to sign one of them. And he says, well, college basketball is getting older. I only want 3 freshmen. Says, I don't care. I'm only going to take 3 freshmen, because he's like, one of them may be a one and done. Another one may be a project. But he was like, if you start taking too many freshmen, you're wasting a year because you're basically developing them for somebody else, because they're highly touted. They're not going to want to wait their turn. So college basketball has definitely changed from the college basketball I saw growing up. Well, that wraps up this episode of the Locked On NBA Big Board Podcast. This was the fun one. Again, there's nobody better to bring on to talk college basketball in the depth and the rosters and this subject on Alabama than Leif Thulin. But once again, thank you for making the Locked On NBA Big Board Podcast your first listen of the day. Now go check out the Locked On NBA Podcast, where the season never ends, providing national expertise with a local perspective. You can find the link on the description. Locked On NBA is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Once again, it's Rafael and Leif, and we are